Michael Thompson spent 37 years believing he was living someone else's dream. Every morning, he'd wake up in a house that felt borrowed, next to a woman whose laugh had become a stranger's echo, working a job that slowly consumed pieces of his soul. But truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it, and sometimes when you can least afford it. They say the average human makes 35,000 decisions a day. Small ones, big ones, unconscious ones that shape the trajectory of our entire existence. Michael never thought much about his choices until the moment he realized they weren't really his at all. Michael Thompson was the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Average height, graying temples, the slight stoop of someone who'd spent too many years hunched over spreadsheets. At 37, he had what most people would call a successful life. A corner office at Henderson & Associates accounting firm, a mortgage on a 3-bedroom colonial in suburbia, and a marriage that had lasted 14 years. But success, Michael had learned, was a peculiar thing. It could look perfect from the outside while rotting you from within. His relationship with Sarah had started in college, born from shared study sessions and late-night conversations about their dreams. She wanted to be a photographer, to capture moments that mattered. He wanted to write stories that would make people feel less alone in the world. They were going to travel, to create, to build something beautiful together. Instead, they'd built a life that felt like a carefully constructed prison. It started small, as these things do. After graduation, Michael's father offered him a position at the accounting firm. Just temporary, just until he got on his feet. "Writing doesn't pay the bills, son," his father had said. The same man who'd spent 40 years in the same office, wearing the same expression of quiet resignation that Michael now saw in his own mirror each morning. Sarah got a job at a photography studio, but it was mostly weddings and family portraits. Safe, predictable work that paid well, but left her artistic soul starving. They told themselves it was temporary. They'd save money, get established, then pursue their real dreams. Years passed, like pages turning in a book they weren't really reading. The temporary job became permanent. The small apartment became a house with a 30-year mortgage. Sarah's camera gathered dust in the closet while she managed the studio's business operations. Michael's notebooks filled with story ideas remained unopened in a box in the basement. They fell into routines that felt like well-worn grooves, impossible to escape. Monday morning staff meetings, Wednesday night dinners with Sarah's parents, Saturday grocery shopping, Sunday meal prep for the week ahead. Each day identical to the last, each year a carbon copy of the one before. Their conversations became functional. Who would pick up dry cleaning? Whether they needed to schedule the furnace maintenance, discussions about retirement savings and insurance premiums. The dreams they'd once shared became embarrassing relics of their naive younger selves, mentioned only in passing with self-deprecating laughs. "Remember when you wanted to write that novel?" Sarah would say sometimes, usually after a few glasses of wine, and Michael would smile that tight smile he'd perfected and change the subject. The truth was, he did remember. He remembered the feeling of words flowing through him like electricity, the way stories would wake him up in the middle of the night demanding to be written. He remembered the manuscript he'd started 6 times and abandoned 6 times, always finding some excuse. Work was too busy, the timing wasn't right, he needed to be more financially stable first. But there was another truth, one he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. He was terrified. Terrified that if he tried to write again and failed, he'd have to face the fact that his dreams had been delusions. Terrified that the safe, predictable life he'd built was actually the best he could do. Sarah had her own fears, her own buried dreams. Sometimes he'd catch her scrolling through photography websites, looking at the work of artists who'd taken the risks she'd been too afraid to take. Her eyes would hold a distant sadness that matched his own, but they never talked about it. They'd become experts at not talking about the things that mattered most. Their marriage had become a parallel existence. 2 people living in the same house, sharing the same routines, but inhabiting completely different emotional universes. They were polite to each other, considerate even. But the connection that had once felt like coming home had faded into something more like being roommates with shared financial obligations. Michael often wondered if this was just what adulthood was, the gradual surrendering of who you thought you'd become in favor of who you needed to be to survive. Maybe everyone felt this quiet desperation, this sense of having traded their authentic self for security and social approval. He'd developed habits to numb the discomfort: an extra drink with dinner, longer hours at the office, fantasy football, leagues and streaming services that helped fill the empty spaces where conversation used to live. He told himself he was content, that wanting more was selfish, that stability was a blessing many people never achieved. But contentment and resignation weren't the same thing. And deep down, Michael knew the difference. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, while Michael was reviewing quarterly tax reports. The phone's shrill ring cut through the monotonous hum of office life like a blade. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm afraid there's been an accident." The words seemed to reach him from underwater, distorted and strange. "Sarah. Highway 9. Semi-truck. Critical condition." Michael's world tilted sideways. The spreadsheet on his computer screen blurred into meaningless numbers as his hands shook, reaching for his car keys. The drive to the hospital passed in a haze of red lights and desperate prayers to a God he hadn't spoken to since childhood. The ICU waiting room smelled like disinfectant and despair. Dr. Martinez was a small woman with kind eyes who delivered devastating news with practiced gentleness. Multiple trauma. Internal bleeding. They were doing everything they could, but the next few hours would be critical. Michael sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the institutional gray walls, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not just fear for Sarah, though that consumed him, but something deeper. A recognition of how much time they'd wasted, how many conversations they'd avoided, how many moments of real connection they'd postponed for some day. Hours crawled by. Michael called Sarah's parents, his own parents, a few close friends. Each conversation felt surreal, as if he were reading lines from a script. "There's been an accident. We're at the hospital. I'll call with updates." As evening settled outside, the waiting room windows, a nurse approached him. Sarah was stable but unconscious. He could see her now, but only for a few minutes. The ICU was a maze of beeping machines and hushed urgency. Sarah lay in the narrow hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Her face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, but peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping. Michael pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her hand. It felt cold, delicate, like something precious he'd forgotten how to hold properly. "I'm here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm right here." That's when he saw it. Her camera bag, somehow retrieved from the wreckage, sitting on the visitor's chair. The bag she'd carried everywhere in college, covered now with hospital tags and personal effects labels. Without really thinking, Michael reached for it. Inside, beneath her wallet and keys, he found something that made his breath catch. A manila folder, thick with printed pages. The top sheet was a letter from National Geographic, dated just 3 days ago. "Dear Ms. Thompson, we are pleased to inform you that your photo series Invisible Lives has been accepted for publication in our upcoming issue on urban solitude. Your submission demonstrates exactly the kind of authentic storytelling we look for." Michael's hands trembled as he read. Below the letter were copies of photographs he'd never seen. Images Sarah had somehow captured in secret moments around their own neighborhood. An elderly man feeding pigeons at dawn. A young mother pushing a stroller past empty storefronts. A teenage boy skateboarding alone under a streetlight. They were extraordinary. Each image held a story, a moment of human truth that spoke to something universal about loneliness and connection, about the beauty hidden in ordinary lives. This was the work Sarah had dreamed of creating, the artist she'd always been beneath, the layers of compromise and resignation. But there was more. At the bottom of the folder, Michael found something that shattered him completely. A printed email thread between Sarah and a literary agent, dated over the past 6 months. The agent had read excerpts from a novel Sarah had mentioned, excerpts she'd found in her husband's old notebooks. Michael's novel. The story he'd abandoned years ago, the one he'd convinced himself was worthless. The agent wanted to see the complete manuscript. She believed it had real potential for publication. Sarah had been trying to surprise him. She'd been secretly advocating for his dreams while pursuing her own. She'd been fighting for both of them in ways he'd never known, never imagined. Michael sat in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the sound of machines keeping his wife alive, and felt 37 years of self-deception crumble around him. Every assumption he'd made about their life, their marriage, their mutual surrender to mediocrity, all of it was wrong. Sarah hadn't given up on her dreams. She'd been nurturing them in secret, probably afraid to share them with him because he'd become so expert at crushing hope, so committed to the story that their creative lives were over. And she hadn't given up on his dreams either. While he'd been buried in resentment and resignation, convinced that she no longer saw him as the man she'd fallen in love with, she'd been working to resurrect the writer he'd abandoned. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Sarah still loved the man. He used to be. Maybe she'd been waiting all these years for him to remember who that was. Michael looked at his wife's unconscious form, at the evidence of her secret hope spread across his lap, and realized that everything he thought he knew about his life had been a lie he'd told himself. They weren't trapped in parallel existences. Sarah had been reaching across the gap between them all along. He'd just been too afraid to see it. The monitor beside her bed showed her heart rate, steady but fragile. Each beep was a second passing, a moment they couldn't get back. Michael understood with sudden and terrible clarity that time wasn't something you could save for later. It was something that disappeared whether you used it or wasted it. He'd wasted so much time. Sarah survived. After 3 surgeries and 2 weeks in intensive care, she opened her eyes on a Thursday morning and smiled at Michael with the same expression she'd worn when they were 22, and the world felt infinite with possibility. "I was having the strangest dream," she whispered, her voice rough from the ventilator. "We were young again, and you were reading me one of your stories." Michael's throat tightened. "What happened in the story?" "I don't remember, but I remember thinking it was beautiful." He showed her the folder then, the National Geographic acceptance letter, the email from the literary agent. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of relief. "I was so scared to tell you," she admitted. "I thought you'd be angry that I'd sent your work without asking. I thought maybe you didn't want those dreams anymore." "I thought you didn't want them?" Michael said. "I thought we'd both given up." They talked through the afternoon, sharing confessions and apologies, unraveling years of misunderstanding. Sarah had been taking photography classes at the community college every Saturday morning for 2 years, the time Michael thought she was grocery shopping. She'd been working on the photo series during her lunch breaks, documenting the hidden poetry of their ordinary neighborhood. She'd found Michael's notebooks in the basement while looking for Christmas decorations, had read the novel fragments with tears in her eyes, remembering the man who used to stay up all night chasing the perfect sentence. "You were so good, Michael. Are so good. I couldn't understand why you'd stopped believing in yourself." Michael couldn't explain it either, not fully. Somewhere along the way, he'd confused security with happiness, routine with contentment. He'd let fear masquerade as practicality, had convinced himself that dreaming was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd been afraid to want things, afraid to try and fail, afraid to be vulnerable enough to hope for something better. Sarah's accident had been a violent wake-up call. But Michael began to see that life had been offering gentler invitations all along. Every time Sarah lingered over a photography magazine, every time she asked about his old stories, every time she suggested they travel somewhere new or try something different, she'd been trying to wake him up, to remind him that they still had choices, that it wasn't too late to become who they'd dreamed of being. The recovery was slow. Sarah needed months of physical therapy, and their conversations about the future were careful, tentative. But something fundamental had shifted. They talked differently now, about hope instead of obligations, about possibilities instead of limitations. Michael submitted his novel to the literary agent. She offered representation within a week, and the book sold to a publisher 6 months later. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was real, it was his, and it proved to him that his dreams hadn't been delusions after all. Sarah's photography series was published in National Geographic to wide acclaim. The success led to gallery showings, freelance assignments, and eventually her own studio specializing in documentary photography. She was 41 when she finally became the artist she'd always been inside. But the external successes weren't the real transformation. The real change was in how they saw each other, how they saw themselves, how they moved through their days with renewed intention and presence. They learned to recognize the difference between being busy and being alive. They started taking walks after dinner, really talking again instead of just managing logistics. They traveled, not expensive vacations, but weekend drives to small towns where Sarah could photograph and Michael could write in coffee shops that felt like discovery. They learned that it was possible to rebuild a marriage, to excavate the people they'd buried beneath years of routine, and rediscover why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Michael often thought about that moment in the hospital, sitting beside Sarah's unconscious form, with the evidence of her faith in him spread across his lap. How many people lived their entire lives without realizing that the person sleeping next to them still believed in their dreams? How many marriages died not from lack of love, but from lack of courage to be vulnerable with each other? He'd come so close to losing everything, not just Sarah, but the chance to know who they could still become together. The accident had been random, cruel, but it had also been a gift. It had forced him to see the truth about his life in time to change it. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is to have their assumptions shattered. Michael had spent years believing he was trapped, that his dreams were childish, that Sarah had stopped seeing him as anything more than a reliable provider. The truth was that he'd trapped himself, that his dreams were still valid, and that Sarah had never stopped believing in the man she married. The accident had lasted seconds, but its impact would shape the rest of their lives. It taught them that time wasn't something to be saved for later, that love required the courage to be seen and known, that it's never too late to remember who you really are. They still lived in the same house, but it felt different now. Not like a prison, but like a launching pad. They still had routines, but they chose them consciously instead of falling into them by default. They still faced ordinary challenges, but they faced them as partners in the truest sense, united not just by shared obligations, but by shared purpose. Michael learned that the truth had always been there, waiting for him to be brave enough to see it. Sometimes clarity comes in quiet moments of reflection. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of crisis, when all your defenses are stripped away and you have no choice but to face reality. For Michael, truth came 1 second before he almost lost everything that mattered. In that hospital room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines, he finally understood what he'd been too afraid to see. That love and dreams don't die from neglect. They just wait, patient and persistent, for someone to remember they're worth fighting for. Michael's story reminds us that truth often hides in plain sight, waiting for us to be brave enough to see it. How many of us are living in the shadow of our real lives, convinced that our dreams are too late, too risky, too foolish to pursue? How many relationships are starving for the kind of honest conversation that Michael and Sarah finally shared? The most powerful truths often come not in moments of triumph, but in moments of crisis, when we're forced to see past our carefully constructed defenses and face who we really are. But we don't have to wait for catastrophe to wake us up. We can choose awareness. We can choose courage. We can choose to see the truth while there's still time to act on it. What truth have you been avoiding? What dream have you buried beneath layers of practicality and fear? Sometimes the person we're meant to become is waiting just 1 second away. One conversation, one choice, one moment of courage from changing everything. Thank you for listening to 1 Second Before. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of the moments that define us. Until next time, remember, the truth is always there. The question is whether we're brave enough to see it.